Welcome back to another Kentucky Derby profile here on Racing Rundown. Today we are going to be discussing Disarm, runner-up from the Louisiana Derby, going into this year's Kentucky Derby. And I do want to make a slight correction before we get any further. I did write TBA for the jockey on the template, but I do believe that Joel Rosario will retain the mount from the Louisiana Derby. So that's something that I wanted to clear up there, because Joel Rosario was at Oaklawn the day of the Lexington when Disarm had his final prep into the Kentucky Derby. But Disarm is a horse that there's certainly things to like about him going into this year's Kentucky Derby. So a lightly raced-ish horse going into the Kentucky Derby. I've mentioned that my bare minimum for horses that I would like to see among number of starts going into the Derby is 5, and he is at that 5, I should say. Did have to prep in the Lexington to get into the Kentucky Derby. Was not in the original body of the field, but worked his way in with the Lexington placing, and we will talk about that. Broke his maiden all the way back in August of last year, and a pretty salty maiden race that he broke his maiden in. Arthur's Ride is a horse who ran some credible races in the allowance company. Croupi was in the Wood Memorial and has, while still a maiden, has some good efforts to his name. Perform won the Federico Tessio. Rocket Can, Wadsworth, all horses that were good at points. Even Point Proven is another horse that has turned in some good efforts. So that was a salty maiden race that he broke his maiden in, but didn't run again until February 19th at Oaklawn, going a mile. And in that race, he was kind of one-paced by a horse with sprinter speed in Two Eagles River, who ran okay in the Arkansas Derby for what he is. But that's Two Eagles River is a horse that will probably turn in some good races between the 6 to 7 furlong trips. So that's and it's also worth mentioning that was off of a significant layoff, but he jumped in from that race without an effort without a win at 2 turns in his furthest career effort to that point being a mile, and he moved up to the 1 3/16 of the Louisiana Derby, and he turned in a very impressive effort there, especially considering that he was a horse that was coming from further back in that race, and there was absolutely no pace early on to close into. But as a result of the point system having been changed to allow to reallocate the amount of points that are given out, Disarm did not pick up enough points initially with the runner-up effort in the Louisiana Derby, since that was his only start on the Derby trail. So Steve Asmussen had to wheel him back in the Lexington, and I've been talking about this over the course of a couple of the previews that I've been doing, and I'll get to that in the cons there. But he had to run in the Lexington, and he ran 3rd there. But I will mention, I talked to Jay Pribman today. That will be something that will air on Racing Rundown next week, on the day I'm recording this, Wednesday. And Jay kind of mentioned, and something that I will certainly second, is that race kind of seems like it was a means to an end for Steve Asmussen and Ron Winchell, because this was a horse that they clearly looked at by his Louisiana Derby effort. This is a horse that has the talent to be in the Kentucky Derby, but didn't have the points to get in there. And connections, he was also not among there were also several horses in front of him, so we would have needed a lot of defections to get in. So connections said, okay, we're going to wheel him back in 2 weeks, just get him into the Derby. And I would wonder if they went very conservative with him going in, prepping into the Lexington, and getting him in there. He did have a couple of works going into the Lexington, but I would wonder if, just internally Steve Asmussen and those folks were thinking, okay, let's just get him there. We need to run 3rd. If we can get him to just run 3rd here, we'll be in the Kentucky Derby, and then we can move forward with move forward with the progression that we saw from him in the Louisiana Derby. So that's really looking at what he has done going into these races. Now, I will say about Disarm, speed figures aren't the greatest for him. He's kind of, a little bit below the mean of this 3-year-old crop. His career highs in 90. Again, I'm not the biggest speed figure person, but if you're a speed figure person, this is a horse you're not too crazy about. He did sort of run this, he did, or not sort of, he did run the same number in his first two efforts. I mean, you can kind of really ignore the first effort because that was an early 2-year-old start where he got a 66. His 2-year-old figures were rather nice, or his 2-year-old figure, I should say, was rather nice. The 86 that he put up when he broke his maiden at Saratoga, but kind of around the mean, a little bit below the mean in terms of figure things. So that's something to think about if you're someone who really does value the speed figures. So we'll get into the pros with him now first. And the biggest thing that I will say with him, this is a horse that is absolutely going to love getting the move up in trip. He is bred on the gun runner Tappet cross, which screams 2 turns all over the place. He'll absolutely love the 1.25 miles. He's also coming out of the Louisiana Derby. The Louisiana Derby has become one of my favorite preps to take horses out of, or to look at horses going into the Kentucky Derby, because ever since it was moved up to the 1 3/16, when it's been run in, or when the Derby, I should say, has been run at its normal time, because the first year the Louisiana Derby was run in March and the Derby was in September, obviously with COVID. But 2021 and 2022, horses exiting the Louisiana Derby turned in, and horses exiting fairgrounds preps, for the most part, turned in very solid efforts. Now, there were only 6 horses in the Louisiana Derby last year, but the big one is Epicenter, ran second in the Kentucky Derby. The year before, Hot Rod Charlie and Mandaloon and Midnight Bourbon all turned in good efforts there. So the Louisiana Derby is a prep that I really, really like, because it gives horses the opportunity to get at the trip before the Kentucky Derby and go a little bit further than they would have if they were running in the traditional 1 and 1/8 prep races. So he's going to appreciate the step up in trip, and I already laid it out. The Louisiana Derby is a very good race for horses prepping in the Kentucky Derby. And then I also talked about it with the Lexington being an easy race to toss. That was a cutback in trip to the 1 1/16, which obviously wasn't going to go well for him. And I'll use the phrase that Jay Privman used when I talked to him today. It sort of seems like that race was a means to an end to get him into the Kentucky Derby, because, as I said, he was not going to get enough defection to get in there. The connections see this as a horse that belongs in the Kentucky Derby, and I would certainly agree with them. So they just ran him there to get him the points. It was a 3rd place finish. He did enough to get there. And I will mention that they didn't really do a lot of backing up in the Lexington. Arabian Night tried to make every single yard there, and First Mission was coming from 3rd in that spot. So, and you look at where Disarm was coming from, not to mention at Keeneland with that short 1 1/16 stretch, or with that short first wire in the 1 1/16 races at Keeneland, was never going to work well for him. So you can toss the Lexington, and then most of it most of the rest of the pros are about trip. So we get to the cons. I did mention the last prep was a 1 1/16, and I don't love the last prep being a 1 1/16, but I'm kind of just including that as a placeholder because I couldn't find a great other con for him. I guess you could substitute figures, but I don't love, just throwing something basic like the speed figures for him. And it is also a concern because it's been almost 25 years since a horse has won the Kentucky Derby with their final prep being at a 1 1/16. Another thing is he hasn't beaten winners yet. And that's certainly something, it's not a deal breaker. Obviously, Rich Strike showed us that last year, but it's something to be concerned about. This is a horse whose only victory has come in the maiden special weight company, and he doesn't have a victory at 2 turns. Now, again, that's not a complete deal breaker, but those are a couple of things to think about. And then he hasn't had to overcome significant adversity. I mean, in the Bluegrass, I keep mixing the Lexington up with the Bluegrass. The Lexington, he didn't really overcome anything. He was further back there, but he didn't win that race. And then you go to the Louisiana Derby. He got a perfect run through there in that spot, was able to pick up the 2nd place effort. And then you go to the allowance race that he had at Oaklawn where he lost to Two Eagles River. Two Eagles River tripped out. And so that, I guess you could say that's kind of adversity there for Disarm. And Disarm didn't overcome that. So It's going to be, I would say that the draw where he gets is very important, but this is a horse that hasn't had to overcome a lot in what has been what has been a rather short career for him. I talked about 5 starts being the bare minimum that I want to see from Kentucky Derby starters. And that's certainly something that I think about. However, I will say for Disarm, there's also not a lot of early foot in this Kentucky Derby, and for a closer, that could be something that is a little bit hazy with him. But I will say, most years in the Kentucky Derby, there are horses that close into it that hit the board at prices. I have been very successful with finding those horses. Obviously, we did that with Rich Strike last year, and I was also fortunate enough to be able to do it with Country House in the first year of Racing Rundown. Disarm is a horse that I think could potentially be one of those horses, especially because the value, or that he was kind of getting wise guide a lot after the Louisiana Derby. The Lexington run kind of killed the wise guy vibes for him. I wouldn't take the Lexington at face value. I would just view that race as a means to an end that just kind of happened in order to get him to the Derby. I think Disarm makes a lot of sense as a horse to potentially hit the board this year in the Kentucky Derby. But there are those negatives. He hasn't beaten winners. He hasn't had to overcome adversity, and he's also a closer in a Derby that doesn't really look like there's going to be a lot of pace in it. So with that being said, that's going to be it for this profile. Be sure to check out the playlist in the description below to take a listen to our other previews. Be sure to be around here next Tuesday when we have our big Kentucky Derby preview. We will see you then. Have a good one.